and welcome to the North Central Mass Good Morning Breakfast, and I'm pleased to welcome you here. It's our first event of the year, and it's good to see such a great turnout. I'm Chris McCarthy. I'm President and COO of Fidelity Bank and Chair of the Chamber Board. And as we get started, I'd like to just recognize Roy and Kat and the Chamber team for putting today's event together. Maybe a round of applause for them. So September's a busy month, and I'm pleased to kick off and share with you some of the events that are going on at the Chamber, and just to give you a taste of a few things that are happening that you might be interested in. On September 20th, we're holding the Human Resource Council, where Corey Higgins, a partner at Myrick O'Connell, will give an update on the Paid Family Medical Leave Act and a legal update on the HR laws over the past year. On September 21st, the young professionals of North Central Massachusetts will kick off their networking event at Main Street Gift and Cafe in Leominster. And a big thank you to Mayor Mazzarella for providing the space and the appetizers for the event. On September 22nd is legislative and candidate reception at the Choxet Inn in Sterling. And this event's a wonderful opportunity for you to meet and greet with our local representatives, elected officials, and those that are running for office in November. And we'd like to thank Mount Wachusett Community College for sponsoring this event. And then on September 27th, the Chamber is holding the second annual Work North Central Mass hiring event, which is at Wachusett Mountain Ski Area. And we still have a few tables left for that event, so if you're interested in participating in that, please talk to Kat, and she'll be happy to find a spot for you. And of course, there's a lot of events, as you know, that the Chamber runs. It's amazing all the different things that you can attend that can help you with networking and help you meet people and support your business. So we'd encourage you to look at the northcentralmass.com website and see what the different events are that are available to you. So with the housekeeping taken care of, I'd like to thank Hometown Bank for sponsoring this morning's event, and I'd like to invite my friend Rob Morton, President and CEO of Bank Hometown, to the stage to make a few remarks. Rob?
Thank you, Chris. As I was driving up 190, I was reminiscing when I started my career back some 35 years ago at Shawnee-Worcester County National, and maybe some of you remember that name, maybe younger people probably don't, but we actually had a pretty good presence up here. We had a couple of branches in Gardner, Timpani Plaza downtown. We had a branch in Westminster, and actually my first assignment was to be the branch manager at Westminster. And then we had a couple of locations in downtown, one in downtown Fitchburg, and then also on John Fitch Highway, and that was my second assignment. And back in the day, before debit cards, we had like 8 tellers all the time, 5 retail, 2 commercial, 1 vault teller. We had 2 ATMs and 3 night drops. And I'm going to kind of reference that in a second in terms of the trends in the industry. But a little bit about Bank Hometown and who we are and what we're about. So Bank Hometown, we're actually a family of 3 banks, 3 independent banks. We have Bank ESB, which is in the western part of the state. We have Abington Bank and Envision, and basically we're about to close on the merger with Envision into Abington Bank. And when that is done, Abington Bank will be about $1.4 billion. Hometown, which we are Central Mass, will be about $1.4 billion, and then our sister bank to the west is about 1.7. So collectively, will be a $4.4 billion bank. And the way I like to describe things, we're the best of both worlds, right? We have the size, the capacity, the brain power, the ability to keep up with the technology as any bigger bank, but we also have the heart, the soul, the responsiveness, and the approachability of a community bank. So no matter where anyone is in their business cycle, small, medium, or large, we have the capability to take care of them. In terms of where we're located, as you can see, Bank ESB is to the west. Bank Hometown, we have 3 locations up here in North Central. Athol, we have Mark, our branch manager from Athol. We also have Erica, our branch manager from Lancaster. And then Donna, which I'll talk a little bit more in a second, which she loves when I do that, right, Donna? Our branch manager in Leominster. And then we have 4 branches in Central Mass, 4 branches in South Central Mass, and then 5 branches in Northeast Connecticut. And then you see a bunch of dots to the east. That's a combination of our Abington and Envision. And one of the great things about this Envision merger is that they have a very robust mortgage company that we're going to basically rebrand into Hometown Mortgage. So pretty excited about that. So with all that said, the most important things to us are our community, our customers, and our employees. And I could, say that to you, and it will sound like an infomercial, but let's, don't take my word. Let's talk about, in terms of our community giving, the Giving Tree, we've donated nearly $280,000 last year, $2.3 million, as you can read. And just some of the local beneficiaries of that: Newview, North Star Family, and Luck Inc., and there's a bunch more. So we do believe in the community bank spirit of giving back to the communities that support us. Our employees, we were ranked Top Workplace USA Award through Energage. Basically, that is an employee survey, so our employees believe that we are a great bank, too. And then, lastly, the community, right? For the 5th year in a row, Donna and her team, Cindy, and the rest of the folks in Leominster have been voted the best bank in the greater Leominster-Fitchburg area, according to Market Survey. So it's not me saying it, right? It's our community that we support through our donations. It's our employees that say that we're a great bank to be part of, and it's you. So with that said, I do believe my 5 minutes is up. Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Rob, and thanks for those comments. And thank you again to Hometown Bank for supporting today's event. At this time, I'd like to invite Leanne Scales from Mount Wachusett Community College to come on up. She's going to be our MC for today's event, so please welcome her to the stage.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I'm so happy to see all of you and see so many friends in the audience. President Vanderhoeven wanted me to say hello. He very much wanted to be here today, but we have a huge welcome back event on campus for our students, so he sends his best. But thank you, Chris. Our first guest is someone who, I don't know if you know that I don't know you, Mark, but I know your institute well. As a UMass grad, I am very familiar with Donahue Institute, and I am so grateful for all the work that your institute does. As you know, the Donahue Institute specializes in demographic, socioeconomic, and labor market issues. So important to everyone in this room. We all run on data. Without it, we're lost. We're rudderless. In his time at the Institute, Dr. Melnik has served as the principal in charge on projects such as clients like the Boston Foundation, City of Boston, City of Cambridge, MassDOT, the New England Foundation for the Arts, Mass Development, the Boston Private Industry Council, and the North Central Massachusetts Chamber of Commerce. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Mark Melnik to the stage.
Thanks. Good morning.
I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Excuse me a second. Yeah, I'm Mark Melnik. I direct economic and public policy research for the UMass Donahue Institute. I'm a returning champion. I think this is my 4th time doing the economic breakfast in some form, or some breakfast here at North Central. Roy, I need probably at least one more because my kids are getting a little mad about the way this is working out for them. The other day, I've been on tour for a couple of days and was explaining to my kids, okay, yeah, Dad's going to be gone for a couple of days, be good for Mom. And, oh, where are you going to be? I was like, well, I'm going to be in Amherst for some staff stuff, and then I'm going to be in Fitchburg for a talk, and my 9-year-old has known this routine now. She's like, wait, where are you staying? And I was like, oh, Great Wolf's Lodge. She goes, wait, are we going? And I was like, no, honey, you guys got school in the morning. My 6-year-old shoots in there, and she's like, we don't have to go to school. We don't have to go to school every day. So I think I owe them one. So we got to work that one out. So in any case, want to thank Roy and the North Central Chamber for their support and what's going to be a sneak preview for you all of a study we've been doing at the Institute for the last several months, focused on the regional workforce, and in particular, not just the current workforce, but more to the question of the labor supply in the region in the future. When Roy first came to me about this idea, we were super excited about it. We talked about it as a kind of thought exercise that has really short, medium, and long-term implications on the region, and it really cuts across different demographic groups. I'll have a bunch of data slides in here. You guys have seen me, several of you I think have probably seen me do the what I call the road show typically, that does like an overview of the economy. I'll have to use notes a little bit more because this is new work, so please excuse some reading. But one of the big takeaways I think for this work right now is two really big summary points. One is that critical to the future of a regional labor force is the development of an adequately trained workforce in the short, medium, and long term. And we're all sensitive to that immediately after the COVID crisis, as people came back to the labor force participation had slumped a little bit. But you also had some significant demographic challenges present themselves in Massachusetts. And in particular, our state economy is really driven over the last 20, 30 years on the growth of the immigrant population in Massachusetts. One of the biggest turn points post-COVID, and maybe a little bit into the Trump administration as well, has been a significant decrease in the immigrant population in Massachusetts. So when employers are like, we're having a hard time finding people to fill roles, they weren't wrong. There were actually less workers in Massachusetts than there were pre-pandemic. But the other thing that was much more critical inside of this is this other demographic trend that we have. For about 15 years before the pandemic, labor market experts were talking about this impending decline in labor force because of the aging of the baby boomer population. The world paused for 2 years, but one thing that definitely happened over those 2 years was we kept getting older. So this issue of an aging labor force is still here, it's still relevant. And I think that the second key point for us as a summary is how to make it easier, more accessible, and more flexible for people to work into the future. And so this is a combination of factors that I'll go into as I get into the presentation. So with that, let me advance. And Kat warned me to press down, not up. But okay, so what was the purpose of the study? Very simply, it was how can we increase labor force participation rates across the region? Not unlike many other parts of the state and nation, North Central is feeling the impact of a stagnant labor engagement beyond the effects of the COVID shutdown. But the region's particularly susceptible to labor force shrinkage due to having an aging population in general. The median age in the North Central region is about 41 years old. That's 30. The median age in Massachusetts is about 38. So we have this difference already. It's a little bit of an older region. And then when it comes to other forms of growth in terms of, of net domestic and international migration, the region lags a little bit. So there's a long-term concern when it comes to labor force growth. Aside from that, some workers are having a hard time in the job market right now. We heard a lot about the Great Resignation and a lot of job change that was taking place. But we do see skills mismatches in the labor market. The unemployment rate is quite low in Massachusetts, but it's high for folks with a high school diploma or less, and it's quite low for folks with a college degree. The industries that are most apt to be growing right now are those in the knowledge sector, so they tend to require advanced education and skill. So how does that alignment occur, and what does that mean for economic growth going forward? And then obviously groups of marginalized workers within the region are the ones who have some of the most significant needs going forward. So again, this gets into the immediate and short and long term. There were three main parts to the research that we did here. First was doing a scan of existing demographic and labor market data in the region. We didn't want to remake the wheel. Like Roy and co. Had a comprehensive economic development strategy done a couple years back. With a lot of excellent work looking at industry sectors and so on. So we really wanted to be focused most predominantly on the workers, what's happening as we project forward with workers, and what maybe some of the trends are in the industries in general, especially given some of the changes post-COVID. From that, we did some case studies and analysis of different kinds of toolkits and other best practices, looking at what others are saying about labor market engagement in general. And third, did a series of interviews with a number of experts. We talked with 19 folks so far. Several of you, I believe, are in this room right now, which we appreciate your insights, but folks in education, workforce development, and industry within the region to kind of understand what the needs were. And from that, try to develop innovative solutions about some of our labor market challenges. And defining the region, you guys are all quite familiar with where you live. But when we talk about the North Central region, we're talking about this combination of 26 communities. The data cut in some weird ways, and when the report comes out, we'll explain all that. For some of the labor market data, we use the Massachusetts definition of the workforce development area. Part of the reason for that is that it allows for easy comparisons across regions in Massachusetts, it's not an actual perfect match to what North Central is. And so other places where we do data analysis where we can use municipalities, we do that as well. And that's all footnoted in the work, but this is just a snapshot of the region. So for today's presentation, I'm going to do a quick overview of some data, talk about the theoretical framework of how we wanted to conceptualize what we were seeing, what are some of the observations and the next steps for some practical work. And again, we're not quite finished yet. We'll be done in a few weeks. So everything here is subject for slight tweaks, and I appreciate any feedback and thoughts that people add on what we're doing here. So in terms of defining the problem, this first graphic that we have here is a line graph showing the population change in the North Central region over the last 50 years. The 2020 census number came in a little higher for the North Central region than we expected. It's just a hair under 280,000 for the combination of 26 communities that make up the North Central region. Population growth has been relatively robust in the region, but a little slower than Massachusetts in general and some other parts other parts of the state. Population growth in Massachusetts is among the fastest in the Northeast, though northeastern states in general have slow population growth over the last 50 years. Turns out people don't love cold weather. And so places like the Southeast and the Sun Belt have seen more robust population growth. But Massachusetts does outpace all the other states that we see in New England, and I think it's really a combination of our colleges and universities and knowledge industries and so on. That said, one additional thing we do at the Donahue Institute, though, is while we help the Secretary, the Commonwealth prepare for the census every 10 years, we take those census and the different municipalities as well. We take those census enumerations and then we produce population projections with them. Those population projections take the base of population in this case 2020, and then uses recent historic trends on birth, death, and migration as it relates to age and gender. That allows us to project out what we expect the population to be in the future. It is not a perfect measure. The future is not set in stone. But what it does say is that this is what the average family size would be. This is the number of children per household or women of a certain age, given as population ages. This is what the migration rates are for different regions of the state. I set all that up because when we did our most recent population projections for the Donahue Institute that are just coming out, that go out to 2050, this is what happens to the North Central region's total population. So we actually see a somewhat significant decrease in the population over a fairly longish period of time. We're talking about 30 years. This is what drives the point of why we wanted to do this research. This region is not alone in this challenge. There's a lot of places that are going to be faced with this, but as population decreases or stagnates, as population gets older, where do your workers come from? I noted already that the region is a little bit behind Massachusetts and the Northeast, Massachusetts and the U.S. on population gains, but this graphic here, indexes of 2010, shows US, Massachusetts, and North Central. You'll see this kind of funky blip that happens between 2019 and 2020. The 2020 census numbers, again, came in a little higher than people expected. So some of the estimates in the years that don't end in 0 will end up getting smoothed out going back, so you won't see that kick in the future once those numbers get revised. But that said, what we see is just this little lag in North Central behind Massachusetts and the US on population change between 2010 and 2020. But when you fast forward to our projections, what we see here, Massachusetts, we expect to have gained population about 11% between 2010 and 2050. North Central region, we would expect to lose about 4% of total population on that same time period, again, driven a lot by migration patterns and age patterns. We call this in research a age pyramid because traditionally it looked like an upside down pyramid. What's interesting that happens here is that, as I keep noting about an aging population, age pyramids soon start looking like rectangles. And what ends up happening here is on the left we see the age distribution in the North Central region in 2020, and on the right we see the projected age distribution for North Central in 2050. So one of the things is what is the fatter parts of your age distribution in 2020 just kind of slide down the snake, as it were, out to 2050. So you end up with this higher concentration of older folks in the region as you go out into the future. What's the interesting point to highlight here is in 2020, about 17% of the region is 65 or over. By 2050, it'll be about a quarter of the total population in the state. This has implications as we think about the labor force. Today, the North Central labor force is made up of about 156,000 workers. Our projections to 2050 would have the labor force decreasing about 13%, or down to 136,000 workers. How do we come to this? We take the base population that we estimate in 2050 and apply current day labor force participation rates by age to the population that we project. This is also where there's power in the public policy opportunity, because can you change the labor force participation rates? And if you did, then the size of the labor force can increase. But why does the labor force go down so much? Well, the labor force goes down so much because the population we have such a larger proportion of the population being 65 or over. Then labor force participation obviously goes down dramatically for people 55 to 64, and then very dramatically from 65 and up, right? So this is why we end up seeing this dramatic change in the overall labor force size in a medium-term projection. This next graphic here looks into some of the labor force participation rates around the region. The top bar you look at is labor force participation for Massachusetts. That's at 68%. And when we say labor force participation, I'm referring specifically to people who are 16 and over. The set of bars underneath it look at the North Central region, the labor force, which is at 67%, so it's basically the state, just a little bit lower. And then the different age groups within North Central. So 16 to 64, it's 78%. So when you take out the oldest folks, it goes up. And then the different age groups within 16 to 24, 25 to 54, where the labor force participation rate is always quite high. And 55 to 64, we start seeing that decrease, and then 65 plus, where it's quite low. Now, it's worth noting, I should say, that labor force participation for older folks in Massachusetts is among the highest in the country. I think because we have such a well-educated labor force, we have a lot of people who stick around in the labor market a little bit longer. So there is opportunity within older workers to find more labor, but it is noteworthy that Massachusetts actually does pretty well on that already. We're a bit of a pace car on that. Okay, great. For other selected groups I wanted to focus on, and it kind of drives a little bit of some of the analysis that we do next is, okay, well, what does labor force participation look like for different groups within the region, and where might there be opportunity to squeeze out new and potential labor long term? I mentioned before at the beginning of the presentation about making it easier to work, more flexible to work. I think that's going to be some of the creative decisions for people in a business community, from a chamber, to think about. You're not going to move necessarily the overall labor force participation rate in the region from 67% to 75% or 80%. That's not terribly realistic. But what would be realistic is when we look at some of these, like how do we get the disabled labor force participation rate to go from 30 to 35, right? How do you take the veteran population's labor force participation rate to go from 50 to 60? And those little tweaks among small populations could have significant impacts when it comes to filling the gaps within a broader labor force. So here, this just touches on that. We see actually quite high labor force participation rate for mothers with children. Foreign born is around 65%. The two that really stand out to me the most, though, is the disabled and the veteran. And we know that the pandemic has actually created some excellent opportunities for folks with disabilities to be able to participate in the labor market in a different way. People with mobility issues have more options available to them in a hybrid or flexible or remote work environment. I'm reading a really interesting book, not for this project, but it just kind of corresponds with this, called Out of the Office, which was a couple, I highly recommend it if anyone hasn't heard of it. It's a couple of journalists who actually decided to go 100% remote before the pandemic and really just kind of writing about what flexible work actually means for people. And one of the things I wasn't terribly sensitive to was also people with different kinds of psychological, emotional, or other kinds of cognitive disabilities that things that people with like anxiety disorders or whatever, and being like how the office place really encourages a lot of face-to-face interaction and being gregarious with one another and so on, and being like, well, that could be really hard for some people. And working from home allows a different kind of interaction for folks. So there are some opportunities in those places. Two other things I wanted to hit on for the region. This one's just super interesting to me. This is looking at North Central and the share of total population by employment status. We're looking at different racial groups here: white, black, Asian, and Hispanic going across. The orange bar shows the percentage of that racial group that's in the labor force. The reddish bar looks at the second bar looks at the not in labor force. The third looks at the institutionalized. And institutionalized most meaningfully here refers to those folks who are in prison. Because of the couple of large prisons in North Central. And the fourth is active military. I want to call your attention here to the concentration of institutionalized populations for both the Black and the Latinx communities. So where we have 19% of Black non-Hispanic folks in North Central are institutionalized, and 7% of Hispanic. So another opportunity, and I'll touch on this a little bit more as we get into the theoretical framing of this, is the potential for labor force participation for folks who are reentry populations. There's a lot of stigma about folks who were previously incarcerated and being able to find employment. But there's a great opportunity here. Folks with low labor force participation rate, we don't have great data on labor force participation rate on the previously incarcerated, but we know of the stigma. But there's a population that's significant in the region, not necessarily native to the region, but a population who will need opportunities for employment, and we're going to need workers. And so how do we strategically think about accessing that population better? I already also talked about educational attainment a little bit and skills mismatch. This next graphic tells a story that's fairly common, but the educational attainment differences in North Central, but similarly for Massachusetts, by racial group. Massachusetts is the most well-educated state in the nation, but we have stark differences by race. White and Asian educational attainment is quite a bit higher than Black and Latinx, which also presents a different opportunity when we think about skills mismatches in the labor market more broadly. So in terms of framing the issue, that's the data kind of sets up what I think is the problem, right? How do we want to frame this? So what we learned, and some of it's not terribly surprising, but labor force participation rates differ significantly by race, age, educational attainment, and other factors. Some groups have particularly low labor force participation, and it really mirrors some historically marginalized groups, and that there are the potential for overlapping solutions. In our analysis, from here, we try to split workers and the thinking around this around two main groups. Those workers that we consider to be hidden workers, and those workers that we consider to be future workers. When we talk about hidden workers, we're talking most specifically, and I'll get into this in a little bit more depth in a moment, but those people who are just not being fully optimized in the labor market right now, their labor force participation rates are low, and what are the ways in which we can better unlock hidden workers to create more workers in our economy going forward. Future workers is a more naturally future-focused look, because when we look at workers in 2050, we're not talking about me, we're not talking about most of you guys, right? We're talking about our kids, right? Or we're talking about how work has changed in the future, and we're talking about strategic ways of kind of growing a new residential population in a place. So hidden workers, we kind of split into three main groups. Those folks who are missing hours, those folks who are missing from work, and those folks who are missing from the workplace or the workforce. Missing hours are people who they're working, they love to work full-time, but maybe full-time hours aren't available to them. People missing from work are workers who have been unemployed for a long time, but are returning to the labor force and seeking employment. And then missing from the workforce are those folks who they might be able to work, but they're not actively looking. They're the discouraged workers, right? They're the not in labor force. They're the people who aren't captured in the unemployment rate. And so with the normal unemployment rate we think of is the U3. That's what economists call it. And that's the unemployment people usually point to, and it's like around 3.6% right now. There's another measure we call the U6, and which includes discouraged workers, and that number is usually twice what the unemployment rate is. And this kind of gets at all of these people. So who are all the folks on the sidelines who might otherwise be able to work? Future workers, we split into three main groups, which I've already touched on a little bit before. Young people, those folks who are 0 to 14, who they're not working now, but they will be one day. Future residents, people who we would want to see attracted to a region, whether it be growing immigrant population. There's been a lot of tension and conversation about the North Central region being a relatively affordable option for families comparative to other parts of Massachusetts. So how do you bring people into a region? And then naturally the future of work, what does remote work look like 15, 20 years from now? What does hybrid work look like, and those kinds of things? So from that, we created this honeycomb. I just wanted to show it because I thought it was cool. But we created this thing, this graphic here. On the red are who we typically think of as hidden workers, people who we might be able to access now. And in the blue, we have our future workers, or who we might be thinking about in the future. So on the hidden, things like older workers, mothers and parents, caregivers, immigrants, refugees, veterans, people with disabilities, people without a history of employment, previously incarcerated, people from BIPOC communities. And then for future workers, families looking to relocate, retaining local and young professionals, youth under 14, remote workers, young people who are not what we call yet, but young people who are not in education, employment, or training. And then we threw immigrants and refugees over here too, because you can kind of be on both sides, of course. But that's the honeycomb. And from there, we think about this around four main barriers to entry in the economy for the workforce. The traditional skills gap conversation over here on the red, which gets really into that kind of workforce development issues. On the top, geographic barriers, which mainly focus around issues of transportation and housing. On the right, structural barriers on recidivism, discrimination in the job market, and other types of job requirements that may or may not necessarily match what is needed for a job. And then at the bottom, we have work-life balance and kind of thinking about the ways in which work fits within our own lifestyle. One of the important things I think we learned from COVID, and I think employers and others in the business community should be thoughtful of as we think about a shrinking labor force in the future, is the cultural way we've thought about work forever has been fitting our life within our work, but I think thinking more creatively with a smaller labor force is how do we fit work within our lives? And having more opportunities for flexible work and that kind of thing allows potentially for a better work-life balance and being able to encourage more people in the labor market. So first, let me talk a little bit about the geographic barriers one. Each one of these, we take the same honeycomb and just pop out the populations that don't match for that issue. But here, thinking about geographic barriers, we talked with a bunch of folks around the region, and two of the key things that came up for us a bunch was transportation options in the North Central region make it difficult for folks to get access to where the jobs are. That very closely aligns to issues of housing costs in general. And no matter how many jobs exist in Massachusetts, there's always going to be some element of mismatch between where the jobs are and where the workers are. And this is a lot of times driven by high housing costs, transportation infrastructure, and so on. Many people may be ready and willing to work, but not able to due to the lack of means of transportation. Moving closer to jobs for some people isn't an option because rent and housing prices close to the city core or where the jobs are may be too high, and so it kind of squeezes people out into further reaches. And moving west is the cheapest option in Massachusetts typically, but there's little or no public transit or trains west of 495. So the housing cost mismatch is a prevalent issue in transportation short-term solutions. It could be a short-term solution for fixing the fact that people may not be able to afford opportunities close to work. This is a little bit of a text-heavy graphic and text-heavy slide, but something that just basically summarizes a little bit more some of the things I was just saying, that we really have the combination of high housing costs matched with the limited transportation options. In interviews with people in the region, folks would note that North Central is historically a lower cost area, but from these interviews, several noted that the region's lost some of its edge somewhat. Multiple employers reported employees moving south to opportunities in lower cost states. So it's something to keep an eye on. It's a huge problem in Massachusetts broadly. We have extremely high housing costs in the state. They've gone up pretty dramatically in the pandemic. And so this is a factor that will kind of drive how we're able to attract and retain workers. Now, if the population stagnates, one would argue, okay, well, then we'll have this housing supply that people will be able to access. But then there's also the issue of how well housing supply matches the demand, right? So when we have empty nesters in large single-family homes because there isn't an appropriate option for them to move into something smaller, those kinds of things. So continuing to build housing in Massachusetts is a statewide problem, but one that it is critically important to thinking about your labor force size in this region going forward. This next slide, we talk about some short and long-term solutions, but and medium-term solutions. The big punchline for us was addressing the disconnect between where jobs are and where people live. One example, Vermont's United Way Working Bridge program convened employers together to identify where their workers were facing transportation barriers as a group, and they were able to modify existing public transit schedules to better fit their workers. They also created a resource coordinator at the United Way who was able to mediate between employers and employees to address some of these issues. So for example, there was one employee whose car broke down and the resource coordinator found out, and the employer was able to support a car loan with a reasonable monthly payment allowing the employee to stay at work. But there's a number of different ways to be thinking about this around what the public transit options are. We see several employers in Massachusetts doing different things like shuttle services and so on. There's a limited amount of that that's occurring right now in North Central, but some of the some thoughtful things to be on the policy side that can be done. On the skills barrier, this is the more traditional skills gap and workforce development issues. There's been a huge focus on sending high school students. Okay. There's been a huge focus on high school students. Kat just told me I have 10 minutes, and I think what happened last time, Kat, you were like, Mark's just ignoring me now, but I'm not ignoring you. I'll be done in 10 minutes. The focus, there's been a huge focus over the years about sending high school students to four-year universities, but we need to be thinking more holistically about other opportunities from an educational perspective for folks. Again, on this graphic, we have a lot of the different groups who could benefit from different elements of skilled training, particularly in tech training, micro-credentialing, and ways of trying to help disconnected workers be better matched to the labor market in general. Some of the big things, problems on this front really align with college cost. College costs have been rising dramatically, and there's been obviously a huge discussion about this in recent weeks because of the student loan forgiveness program from the federal government. But that's, as a lot of people have highlighted, that does not solve anything when you look downstream about the cost of higher education. It's just really helping a short-term solution right now, so thinking about that for folks in general, but also creating more opportunities for easy training, employers who have training programs available to their staff, as well as affordable vocational training, community colleges, which are always great in this role, but also different elements of micro-credentialing and different forms of creating educational credentials for folks as they enter the labor market. So for us in the short, medium, and long term, we talk a lot about how to get people educated and trained so they can fulfill their workforce potential. Organizations like MassHire have funding to help train select populations. For example, they operate a commercial driver license program for recent reentry and formerly incarcerated workers. They also partner with other organizations such as the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Commission to get people with disabilities working again. Commonwealth Corp's been doing a lot of really awesome work too, and even in interviews highlight, oh yeah, we'd love to work with the Chamber on different things about helping with reentry populations or young people in their training in the labor market. In terms of structural barriers, we talk a lot in the report around requirements, recidivism, and discrimination, and again, highlighting the populations who are affected here. Structural barriers, which kind of can relate to the skill barriers, but I think about these as, on the skills barriers, there are technical skills workers need to fill roles. Then there are structural barriers that discount workers, maybe because of a tangible or a spoken or an unspoken rule within the workplace. That can be bias against workers, and it can be discrimination against workers. So you may have workers who are ready and willing to work, but are unable to access different kinds of jobs. Recidivism is a classic one with concerns about hiring people with a criminal record. There's certain work that it doesn't fit well for, be it working at a giant water park with kids or something like that, and depending on what somebody's criminal record might be, maybe it isn't a good fit. But then there are other opportunities in the labor market where there would be. Another important one is around what I call, and I wrote in my dissertation, is over-credentialing. Because the Massachusetts workforce is so well educated, you have a lot of employers who raise the requirement for a job just because they can. So you have a lot of administrative assistants with a master's degree where, in reality, somebody with an associate's degree may have been able to do that work just as well. But when the applications come through, it's like, oh, well, this person has a master's degree, I should hire them. This ends up, depending on how sticky those requirements are, it could lead to employers being like, well, I can't fill a role because the last person who had this job had this advanced degree and you need to have this advanced degree. And it's like, well, do you? And I think it actually ends up leading to this kind of structural bias in terms of race when we think about educational attainment. You may have folks from BIPOC communities who can do that job, but they're competing against some white kid from Northeastern who has a master's degree, and you're like, well, I'd rather have the person with a master's degree, and then you're indirectly being biased against folks who maybe have more limited education, but the job doesn't actually require that. So a different part of structural barriers. So I think in here, thinking about limiting excessive application filters and things that we use for queuing of workers that eliminate them from opportunities they may very well be able to do. And again, the issues of hesitancy in hiring formerly incarcerated workers. One program that's been looking at this both in the short and medium term is a group called Springfield Works. that target systemic barriers and creates pathways to economic opportunity for folks in Springfield, in particular increasing employment engagement to hire locally and invest in upskilling for worker advancement, and in particular mitigate the negative impact of incarceration by identifying those most at risk at a younger age. I mentioned Commonwealth Corp a little bit ago, and they are doing programming around that, and again expressed a lot of excitement about collaborating with other regions in the state and thinking about how to help with previously incarcerated populations. And the last group we talk about fits in what we describe as work-life balance. There's this in the popular media, there was a lot of this discourse around people don't want to work. But I think one of the things that was highlighted in COVID, well, a few. One is we did, like as I noted, the labor force did decrease a little bit. But separate from that is like the balancing act between managing your family life versus your work life, and especially when you have different elements of care needs. This is a place where encouraging employers and others in the business community to think about what flexible work really means. Flexible work historically has kind of meant flexible from the employer's perspective, right? Your email's in your pocket, you can answer emails any time of day. The office can be remote, you could take your laptop on vacation with you. And so there's a lot of flexibility that was really built but was in a lot of ways, or at least 80% of ways, more employer-focused than employee-focused. But I think as we are being creative about how we solve labor force issues in the future, it's like, what does flexible work look like within a work-life balance? For example, older workers who are retired but maybe want to stay in the labor market, do they want to work 40 hours? Do they need to work 40 hours? Could there be places where there's job sharing and creative thinking around creating more opportunities for employment that aren't 9 to 5 in 40 hours? And this is the kind of thinking that's going to be required as we think about the labor force going ahead. So just getting to a last couple of thoughts on solutions specific to the region. We have a series of multi-purpose solutions for North Central. On this first one, we have kind of like the second tier of the smaller ones. But extending the bus route along Route 2, adjusting transit schedules and their frequency to be more adaptive to workers and their ability to get into work. Create learning roles for non-traditional and lifelong learners within the region, so for people to upskill while they're also at work. Establish career ladders and promotion schedules. Create innovative job roles to hire people without changing company policies. Take employee pulse surveys to monitor worker satisfaction. Hire and promote BIPOC leaders and conform shift times to employee schedules. And some of the bigger ones we identified focused on collaborative opportunities within the region. So everywhere we see collaborate, but collaborate with local firms to implement new worker transit, collaborate with local college and vocational schools to offer training or credentialing, collaborate with local prisons and the community colleges to establish pipelines to careers, and collaborate with community stakeholders to increase the supply of childcare, which is obviously a significant issue for families. And then in terms of next steps, or at least a summary, North Central region is an aging place that we project to have slowed population growth. In combination with flat labor force growth, this presents challenges to local employers. We explored a variety of solutions for hidden and future workers in our report, including the need for increased supply of childcare, implementing new worker transit options, creating innovative training and credentialing programs, establishing pipelines to careers, and fostering relationships with the local community colleges, businesses, and prisons. Historically, people have been shaping their lives around work, as I noted before, but we need to find ways to think about shaping work around the lives of people to make it easier to work. And in order to meet and this gets at that last point, where in order for the North Central region to kind of grow its labor force in the future, that's going to be a critical way of being forward-thinking among other regions, and because this is a universal problem, not one that's necessarily set in stone, but it is a demographic one, because you can't unring the bell of getting older, right? So this is something that is going to define how this region's able to compete over the next 20 or 30 years. So with that, I would just put a plug that we're finishing up the last bits of data collection this next week. We'll be turning in the draft the week after, and I expect something to come out really early in October. So we're excited to share it, though. It's really cool work. And also wanted to acknowledge Cassie Breest, who's out in the back of the room. She's the research analyst on the team and lives in Air, and so it was really exciting for her to be a part of it and get to support the others who worked on this at the Donahue Institute. So with that, I'll stop and turn the show back over. I can tell.
That was wonderful. You did a great job. Wasn't that great? I cannot help but being struck by what a perfect springboard Mark's remarks are for what we're going to talk to my friend Senator Cronin about in a minute. But when I look around the room and I see Mayor DiNatale, Superintendent Jokela, Jeff, right? Jeff Roberge from Mass Hire, President Lapidus from Fitchburg State. This is what we do every day, all day. And one of the driving forces in this region of that strategic connection between workforce, education, is the North Central Chamber under Roy's leadership. And I really think that you all owe yourself a round of applause for being so central. Every single slide, how many people saw their daily work? In what, right? Right. All right. So at this time, we're going to be getting ready to invite to the stage my friend, Senator John Cronin. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Senator Cronin is a former infantry officer in the U.S. Army. He's a combat veteran. Let's have a round of applause for that. He has spent his entire career in public service to his country. Born in Leominster, raised in Fitchburg and Lunenburg, he graduated from West Point, was commissioned as an officer in 2013. He was then honorably discharged from the Army as a captain. He began work at Harvard Law School Legal Services Center, where he worked with one of his passion projects, and that is working with professors and students to provide legal advocacy for indigent veterans. Earlier this year, I don't know when you had time to do this, seriously, he got his JD at Suffolk Law. Senator Cronin has represented us all since taking office. Please join me in welcoming a great public servant and a friend to all of us, Senator John Cronin.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Beautiful.
We're good, Nate? Everybody good? Okay. So this is the perfect springboard. Everything that we watched in this slide is about what we're going to talk about first, which is one of your passion projects and certainly for the Chamber and the region, which is the Education Compact. Let's talk about that.
Absolutely. So I just want to start by echoing what you said, Leanne, and thanking Roy and the Chamber. We've got an outstanding professional team here that really is the glue that brings these different stakeholders together, and the Chamber is truly indispensable. And I think we saw why it's so important that we're all outside of our silos and working together. Frankly, it's easy to feel some pessimism after seeing those sides. And I would just say we can't accept that as our future here in North Central, and we shouldn't. And so I think what we're going to talk about over the next 20 minutes or so are some of the things that we are doing to innovate, to work together, to collaborate, really to change the status quo and to not close our eyes and accept that as our future. And we're doing some very exciting things, but we're doing them at Mount Wachusett Community College, we're doing them at Fitchburg State, we're doing them at Fitchburg Public Schools, we're doing them among industry partners, we're doing it in concert with Mayor DiNatale, we're doing it in concert with our State House delegation. And so this compact that we funded through the ARPA spending process in December funds a position at the Chamber that is my hope for the next 3 years, helps us all keep rowing in the same direction to get at some of those very real challenges that we all saw.
And I want to thank you for part of the work that you and the legislature worked to fund early college. So when we talked about those students that are missing out, and I know this is a topic near and dear to your heart, but Mass Inc., another great resource, says that if a first-generation student takes just one early college course, that means college while you're in high school, they are 2 times as likely to graduate from college. That means when we looked at Mark's data, we have a real tool right here in this region that is working to solve that problem. At Mount Wachusett, 17% of our students are early college. The early college model that we have in partnership with Fitchburg Public Schools, Leominster Public Schools, and of course Fitchburg State University in Leominster and Gardner, is all thanks to your work in the legislature. And this is relatively new funding. Can you talk to me about how funding for that connection between K through 12 college and the workforce and early college came about, and how the $10 million in funding?
Yeah, sure. So, and I've got one slide today, and that's tough for a former military officer. Secretary Bob Gates, who was the Secretary of Defense under Presidents Obama and Bush, he got so frustrated with military officers because every time they came to talk with him, they brought a 20-slide deck. And so he had one rule. He tried having no PowerPoint slides, and they couldn't do it, right? They'd get in front of them, and they couldn't speak. He said, you can have one slide, and you can't read from it. So I brought one slide today, and I promise not to read from it. But my hope is I will talk about these 3 programs, which I believe have the potential to be game changers. And I'll get into that, and I'll get into the funding for it in a bit.
Okay. Well, then let's talk about, I'd like to hear about innovation pathways. I've already talked about early college, but the career technical initiative.
So I would say it all really fits into 2 things, which I would call the broader goal and objective of our office and our work as a state delegation, working in concert with our local leaders. But and we are a team, right? I've got some great staff who's with me. Susan Templeton, our district director, Jake Samopoulos, who does communications for us. But there are 2 things that we work on every day, and these really inform those efforts in ways that should make us excited and optimistic. But one is broader economic development in North Central, and 2 is social mobility. And what is social mobility, right? It's if you are born into a poor family, or if you're born into a working class family, you encounter opportunities in your lifetime that help you go from to improve your condition and meet your full potential and create a better life for your family. That's the founding idea of the American promise. That's the American dream. And I think here in North Central, that's kind of in peril, right? Just based on some of the data that we saw. So social mobility is a huge underpinning of these programs. But I also, just to step back and globally and talk at a high level about economic development in North Central Massachusetts, we are firing on all cylinders. And we can talk about the big 4, healthcare, transportation, workforce development, housing, until the cow goes over the moon. But the most important thing that we need to do here in North Central Massachusetts is create jobs and create high-quality 21st century jobs and be a part of the larger innovation economy here in Massachusetts. So a part of that work, right, is workforce development. And that is really what I've focused my efforts, and I believe we've had some significant impact on in the legislature. But creating that workforce and changing those numbers that we just saw, right? We just saw a slide that said 18% of brown and black people who are part of our population who could be a part of the labor force are in jail. If that's the status quo, we need to seriously address that if we want to seriously talk about social mobility and ending cycles of generational poverty. And we have a capacity issue in terms of skills training in North Central especially. We have one of the best vocational schools in the country, and I would put them up against anybody. But a freshman class at Monty Tech is 350 students, and there are 700 applicants. And it is selective to get into Monty Tech. And right now it is harder to get into Monty Tech if you come from a poor family, if you are economically disadvantaged, if you are a minority, if you have discipline, attendance, issues, right? And those are all predictors of what your economic status is. So that's something that we need to revisit, but that's something that also says it's time to build capacity in our work-based learning opportunities for young people. And so all three of these things do that. But I do really believe that despite some of the pessimism, the tough numbers that we just saw, there's a huge opportunity for growth here in North Central Massachusetts, and especially in the innovation economy, and especially a mile to our east, right at the border, in Devens. My family came here because of the Army base at Devens, like a lot of families in North Central Massachusetts, and stayed. And when the Army base closed, a lot of people said that was the worst thing that could ever happen to our region. I think it's turned out to be the biggest opportunity for us here in the 21st century. There's now 6,000 21st century innovation jobs at Bristol Myers Squibb, King Street Properties, I mean, you name it. There are Ph.D.s who are making some incredible advancements in science. GPS fusion energy is moving in. And one thing that informs how I think about economic development, right, is for every 21st century job that we can create here in North Central Massachusetts, and that is a job in the innovation economy, we are creating 5 jobs in every other sector, right? In healthcare, in business, in banking, in the service industry. So how do we attract 21st century businesses who are making things to come here? Because that's what was the lifeblood of our economy for the 20th century, right? In Gardner, we were making furniture, and Leominster was plastics, in Fitchburg, it was paper. And we have a strong advanced manufacturing base, but we need to reimagine ourselves in a lot of ways to, again, change that trajectory. And I see Bob Ilario out there. I went to school with Bob's kids, Bob Jr., but I think about my own family too. So my grandfather came here with my grandmother. They had 5 kids. All of those kids came back to North Central after going to college. They came back to build their own families here. I'm 32 years old. Yeah. But the kids, I went to elementary school and Bob Ilario's class, there were 30 of us that stayed in middle school together. I'm the only person who left to go to college, left North Central Massachusetts, and came back. And that bothers me, right? And that is something that is different between my generation and my parents' generation. And it's because there's less economic opportunity here than there was 40 years ago or 50 years ago. So the number one thing that we need to do is to make sure that we're competitive here in North Central. We're attracting 21st century industries to sustain that economic opportunity and to make sure we're taking everybody with us too.
I couldn't agree more. And you know, when we're looking at what we're doing here in North Central Mass, the hard work of you and the delegation on Beacon Hill, and I gotta tell you, we couldn't ask for a better delegation. This delegation works together. You've made our region not just visible, but an important voice across the Commonwealth. But we're looking at some changes on Beacon Hill. We're going to have a new administration, and we're going to have some new faces, after the election. And we want to continue the momentum that this delegation has put forward. Can you talk a little bit about what we can all look forward to expect, and more importantly, what do we need to do to help move that ball down the field?
Absolutely, and now I'll kind of jump in depth to my one slide here. But I think the biggest challenge that we face as a region is scaling some of these programs that I'm going to talk about. We know we have a skills gap, we know we have a labor shortage, but we also have a lot of kids who are graduating high school and not entering a career field. And I'll tell, I don't want to get sidetracked, but I'll tell one anecdote from the Army. I had a teacher who was a brigade commander, and he came back, he'd just been in Afghanistan, and he said, my goal was to have the best 5,000 soldier unit that ever went to war. And that kind of struck me, right? I mean, that's a crazy aspiration to have. But I would say, and the delegation is on the same page as me, our goal and our objective is for a young person who is 14 years old and growing up in North Central Massachusetts to encounter more opportunity and more pathways to the middle class than anybody, anytime. And we've got our work cut out for us. But all of these things are growing in state government, so I hope we can expect future growth, but we need to collaborate and make these work on the ground to do that. So I'll talk briefly about innovation pathways, and I think I'm in my freshman term in the Senate. This is the achievement that my office, I am most proud of us really spearheading. But we have innovation pathways programs at Fitchburg High School, Gardner High School, that is being scaled to more than 50 high schools across the state. And what they do is they teach kids a core curriculum that is aligned with local and regional labor market needs. And in North Central, the big programs we have are advanced manufacturing. Fitchburg started an environmental sciences program. But the idea is that kids who maybe aren't going to college, kids who maybe don't have a clear pathway into the labor force right after high school, get a skill, right? And get a skill that is in demand and in need. And so those programs at Fitchburg High School and at Gardner High School are nascent, but they're partnering with local industry, AIS, a lot of advanced manufacturers. And the idea is that when those kids graduate, they're right into a high-paying job that we need here in North Central to continue growing. Career Technical Initiative is something that we funded at $10 million last year, at $20 million in this fiscal year, and we are bringing that to scale. And that is a 3-shift model at our vocational schools. I mentioned that it's 50% selection rate to get into Monty Tech. We need to change that, and we need to have more access to vocational schools. So the Career Technical Initiative is a grant program that is allowing Monty Tech to be open from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. for the population that can't access it or get in during the day, and also adult retraining opportunities from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. at night. So that is something that, again, is new post-COVID, and we are dedicating significant resources to at the state level. And you are the one of the leaders in North Central on this initiative, but early college is the third and final thing that I will talk about. And the early college program in North Central is something that we are absolutely leading the way on. And let me know if I missed anything, but Fitchburg High School, Leominster High School, Gardner High School, Air Shirley this year it expanded to. Mm-hmm. Did I miss anybody? Narragansett.
Sizer.
So what early college allows is dual enrollment for a junior and senior in high school to earn college credits at no cost to them or their family. And we had a kid at Gardner High School who graduated with their associate's degree last year, the day before they graduated from high school. So when we talk,
have dozens of those.
Dozens of those now. There's 7,500 kids enrolled in those programs across the state today. We are planning on scaling that to over 45,000 students in the Commonwealth by 2027. That is a game changer, right? I mean, how do you really address the root cause of incredibly high student debt that's going to buckle people for the first decade or 2 decades of their professional career? You cut it in half, right? And kids who are growing up in North Central have the opportunity to do that now. And as Leanne mentioned, taking one early college class for a first-generation student makes them twice as likely to graduate with a degree. So, because they believe they can do it. And they're in an environment where kids to their left and to their right look like them. And so those are the type of things that we are trying to do on Beacon Hill to double down on, because they are game changers and create opportunity for kids in our community.
And what I'll say is we've been doing early college before it was funded. We've been doing it for almost 20 years, believe it or not. And I will tell you, we thought 20 years ago that students who were coming to get dual enrollment, we were targeting those first-generation students, students of color, and we thought they would have academic barriers, and they didn't. And my friend Bob Jokelin knows this better than anybody. They were prepared academically for college. They had a good education in high school. That wasn't the problem. The problem was they didn't believe they were college material. They didn't believe they'd fit in. So you can give someone a curriculum in high school that is difficult and challenging, but if that student thinks they're not going to fit in on a college campus, they're not going to try. They're not going to apply. So what early college does is it puts them on a college campus when they're still in high school. So they can still participate in their high school life, but they're like, oh, this is a syllabus? I didn't know what that was. It's not that bad. It just tells me what I'm going to study. That's a professor? I thought they were going to be terrifying. They're not. They seem to want to help me. So I can't say enough about what this delegation has done to support this initiative. It's really important. Now, tell me though, in the past you've talked a little bit about P-TECH, and I know that this is part of what you're thinking about for students in the future, but I'd love to hear you expound on that a little bit.
Sure. So P-TECH is a model that exists in other states. It began in New York City. It's been proven to work there in Dallas. And it's another tool in what I would call this workforce development toolkit that we are trying to build. It looks a lot like Innovation Pathways, and it looks a lot like early college. So one thing that my office was able to do was get $1 million to seed fund P-TECH programs in the Economic Development Bill this year. We're hopeful that's going to still pass and go through imminently. But what it does is it allows state government to find relationships between industry and local partners at the community college or high school level. So it allows dual enrollment students to take classes at a place like Mount Wachusett and also work for a wage in an industry partner like Bristol Myers Squibb or you name it. So I think that's what the future looks like. That's how we create opportunity for young people. And there's one data point that I think about all the time, and it was in a conversation I had with Jeremy Roach, who just left Fitchburg High School. But about 25, and I might be wrong, but about 25%, more than 25% of students at Fitchburg High School have a parent that didn't finish high school or get their GED, right? And so if we are really serious about talking about ending generational cycles of poverty, if we are really serious about sustaining and growing the middle class, that is the population where we need to be laser focused on. And these are opportunities that population is going to have when they go through Fitchburg High School or go to Gardner or go through Monty Tech. So those are the programs we need to sustain. That's how we get that incarceration number down. That's how we get labor force participation up. And it's a lot cheaper than paying to incarcerate people. And it creates cycles and ripple effects for generations. I just want to end by telling the story about my grandfather. Does anybody know Dr. Joe Cronin? Is he anybody's dentist? Yeah. So Joe is my grandfather. And he grew up, and we all have stories like this. And he says one thing to me all the time: don't forget who you are and where you come from. And this gets back to that. But he was the son of immigrants. His parents had no formal education. His father couldn't read or write. And in one generation, he went from a kid who grew up in poverty to a doctor. And that is just a lot harder to do in America today. And we don't need everybody to become doctors or dentists. The dentist market is saturated in Leominster especially, so nobody, stay away. But we want every kid who grows up poor to have a shot at building a better life and entering the middle class. And government has a role in doing that.
Well, I can't thank you enough for everything that you said, because that is, I know, it's close to my heart. I know it is close to everyone in this room. We understand that the future for our region depends on that kind of thinking, and I am really excited about it. So we mentioned, of course, the important funding that you secured, and we talked about the position funded for the chamber. I had the great opportunity to chat with Terry Young, who is the new hire, who's going to be doing this work, and lucky us, we get to have a check presentation. So I'm going to be inviting her and Roy up, and we're going to celebrate funding. Is there anything more fun?
Terry, it's all on you now. Yeah, this is you.
Yeah, Terry.
That's good, yeah.